I'm like, ew. And he's like, wow. And I'm like, dude. And he's like, cool. And I'm like, so? And he's like, well. And I'm like, fine. And he's like, great. And I'm like, duh. And he's like, what? And I'm like, no. And he's like, yes. And I'm like, bye. And he's like, oh. So I'm like so bored, and he's like, hey there, and I'm like, hey you, and he's like, one hang, and I'm like, okay, and he's like, oh really, and I'm like, whatever, and he's like, Supremo, and I'm like, uh-oh, and he's like, baby, and I'm like, excuse me, and he's like, you want me, and I'm like, seriously, and he's like, totally, and I'm like, no, and he's like, yeah, and I'm like, no way, and he's like, you bet, and I'm like, I don't think so, and he's like, you're right, and I'm like, loser, and he's like, slut. So I'm in this bar, and he comes over, and I'm thinking, oh my God. And he's like, hi. And I'm like, hi. And he's like, are you on your own? And I'm like, yes. And he's like, no way. And I'm like, it's true. And he's like, I don't believe you. And I'm like, come on. And he's like, I'm serious. And I'm like, cut it out. And he's like, am I embarrassing you? And I'm like, can we stop? And he's like, I saw you come in. And I'm like, okay. And he's like, can I get you a drink? And I'm like, that'd be great. And he's like, what do you want? And I'm like, a soda. And he's like, is that all? And I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, on its own. And I'm like, yes. And he's like, don't you drink? And I'm like, no. And he's like, why not? And I'm like, it's none of your business. And he's like, I'm only asking. And I'm like, well, you started it. And he's like, calm down. And I'm like, I'm sorry. And he's like, don't be. And I'm like, why should I? And he's like, back off. And I'm like, fuck you.